And we've been speaking a lot this morning about, obviously, the challenges, but agriculture has cropped up a lot in the discussions. And so this afternoon, we're going to go into a little bit more detail, especially on the aspect of climate mitigation in agriculture and what the EU's policy mix should be there. And also look a little bit forward at, well, how can we move forward politically also with proposals that could work to try and break some of the deadlock and the barriers that we're obviously seeing in terms of this green agenda or green transition for the agriculture and the food sector. So the session is going to go as follows. We're going to have a short presentation from Julia Bognar, so a colleague at IEEP who runs the Land Use and Climate Programme, and that's going to set the scene. And then we're going to have a panel discussion, and we're really excited to have a really diverse panel with us in terms of expertise, experience. So we've got Valeria Forlin. She's a policy officer at DG Climate Action in the European Commission. Aaron Scheid, he's a fellow at the Ecologic Institute. We've got Rudolf Pulkstenis, he's the vice president of the Young Farmers Association, SEJA. Megan Waters, who is a senior policy advisor at FAIR. And we've got Marco Contiero, who is the EU Policy Director for Agriculture at Greenpeace. So yes, let's get started. Julia, over to you.
Technology. Oh, technology. All right, thanks everyone, and thanks Harriet. So I'll just make sure that this is working here. Nope, it's not, I believe. Great. Okay, so everybody who is here this morning, I think we all heard the same things over and over again, the question about what to do with the agri-food sector, particularly when it comes to climate change mitigation, because this is currently one of the biggest gaps that we're seeing policy-wise right now in the EU Green Deal framework. So there is policy coverage, obviously, with the Common Agricultural Policy, but obviously we're seeing some backtracking there. And then also when we think about the Common Agricultural Policy, the measures that are in the CAP strategic plans, oftentimes, while they have benefits for climate mitigation, don't necessarily have climate mitigation as their primary objective embedded within them. So I think moving forward, that's a big question that's on the table right now, and also other means of facilitating mitigation. So the interesting question about the agri-food sector, and particularly agriculture, is that you need emission reductions. Most of the emissions are coming from fertilizer inputs, from livestock production, and in the EU, you have the unique problem of emissions from organic soils on peatlands, on drained peatlands, and quite a bit of emissions come from there. About 5% of EU's emissions are from drained organic soils. So there's the question of there's an opportunity to increase removals, and how do you go about doing this, and also reducing LULUCF emissions, and then how do you reduce livestock emissions, fertilizer emissions, and other types of emissions, say from manure. And so currently on the trajectory that we're on, as many of you in the room are aware of, is that it's been a slow process of reducing emissions. We saw quite a bit of progress in the 1990s due to regulations for livestock and nitrate pollution. But since the early 2000s, it's really stagnated since then, and we haven't seen a large degree of emission reductions compared to other sectors. And so for 2030, we're essentially expecting the 2023 climate report from the Commission said that emissions with the current measures will go down by about 1%, and then with additional measures, about 5%. And the EEA also released a report recently that said if everything goes according to plan and everything is implemented, then perhaps as high as 8%. But this is still quite not necessarily the progress that we need. So particularly the Commission just published a few weeks ago its communication on the 2040 climate target and made a recommendation for a net 90% reduction target, and also suggested that perhaps there should be removals as high as 400 million tons of CO2 removals. So this would be a combination of LULUCF removals as well as technology-based removals. But there is a large degree of uncertainty right now with how much technology-based removals can accomplish. So that puts a lot of expectations on LULUCF removals of a bit more certainty about how we could accomplish this. So you do need a combination of emission reductions coming from the agricultural sector as well as increasing removals. And to reach the climate target for 2040 and neutrality by 2050, you're going to really need to increase your ambition. And so, well, how are we going to incentivize emission reductions? And the big question this morning was we have a lot of social questions going on at the same time. How do we, approach the problem with farms where they feel insecure, they feel that their income is not secure, particularly small and medium-sized farms. And so how can we address both of these problems at the same time? Because we're sort of at a crossroads here where they will need to coincide. We will need solutions to address both of these. So this is a big question that we want to obviously get the conversation rolling, and we need big ideas and innovative ideas, and so I think that's what we want to sort of use today about this panel and moving forward with all of you here today who are speaking with us. So as I said, progress has been a bit too slow, and so essentially what are we going to need from the agricultural sector to get there? And so we've been talking amongst other think tanks, NGOs, different civil society organizations, and with the Commission, and we're sort of reaching a bit of a consensus about how we could possibly move forward to get the ambition that's needed. And so a lot of people talk about having a specific sectoral target for the agricultural sector, setting a specific direction of travel so that you'd give a level of policy certainty for those in the agri-food sector where they know they're going to have to reduce their emissions and they know by how much and they know it needs to be accomplished. And people talked about it this morning, touching upon the fact that it cannot just be farmers alone that are working towards reducing emissions. As we talked about, farmers are living on thin profits, and so there's going to need to be large-scale investments, but there are also large downstream and upstream actors who have a lot of the added value in agri-food value chains. And so how do we activate this power, this market power that these actors have to make the right kinds of investments that are needed? And then a lot of policy right now in the EU for agriculture is focused on what happens on the farm. But we need to look at the whole value chain, as I just suggested, and particularly downstream with consumers. How do you incentivize changes in consumer behavior? What kind of measures would be effective, particularly at the EU level? There's not really a lot of policies right now out there that are specifically focused on consumers. So this is something that's going to need to be addressed as well. And you're going to need, as we said this morning, large-scale investments and financing. You're going to need more than just CAP subsidies. So CAP subsidies will be fundamental, but you're going to need other types of investments that are coming into the sector. So how do we activate private investments and financing? And then a big question that's being discussed in the DG CLIMA commissioned a study last year on looking into potential polluter pays options for the agricultural sector. And so perhaps maybe putting a price on emissions in the agricultural sector might be able to help incentivize the changes that are needed, because currently agriculture is the only sector that's outside either ETS 1 or ETS 2. So could this be potentially a way of internalizing the true costs of food production and starting to incentivize the changes that are needed? And for removals, with removals, there's a lot of uncertainty in agriculture, particularly for soil-based removals, because there's a lot of fluctuations. But nevertheless, it is still part of the solution. So how do you provide incentives to increase removals? And again, we're going to need actual real reductions, but for removals, maybe there needs to be targets for that as well. And obviously, the nature restoration law was something that came up again and again this morning, too, about this. This is something that will be essential to meeting our climate targets, and particularly for the LULUCF emissions and removals, to be able to work towards that. So maybe perhaps having more genuine coordination between biodiversity objectives and climate objectives is needed moving forward, particularly in agriculture, and particularly for resilience and adaptation as well. This is going to be important. And lastly, we're going to need a really strong system of monitoring, reporting, and verification of emissions and removals. This is something that's not really there right now, but obviously the Commission has recognized this, and the carbon removal certification framework is an opportunity to start moving towards having an MRV system for agriculture and being able to have a better idea of how emissions are working on farm and how farmers can reduce their emissions and also increase their removals. So the larger question that we wanted to pose today is, what kind of policy mix do we need? So how do we change the current framework that we're working with? And then what are some additional instruments that we can talk about for the next policy framework when we're working towards 2040 and 2050? We need to start thinking long-term too, to how to reach our goals for them. A CAP is something that came up this morning, but perhaps having more targeted funding for climate action under the Common Agricultural Policy, and also having short-term focused investments under the CAP, but also long-term payments for ecosystem services within the Common Agricultural Policy. The Industrial Emissions Directive was recently reformed, and trilogue agreements have been completed for that. There was an original proposal to include livestock emissions from cattle, and this might have been a way to tackle methane emissions from livestock. But it's been excluded from the final version, but to be opened and questioned again about whether it should fall under the IED in 2026. So that's still a question left open. And then the farm to fork strategy targets as well. These are something that sort of have not been followed up with recently. So we saw the pesticides target that sort of, and the sustainable use of pesticides proposal fall by the wayside. And so the other targets that were more climate related, those related to nutrient loss reduction and also fertilizer use, there hasn't really been any follow-up conversations on that. So should we pick this back up again and think about these kinds of targets that could help? And then strategic planning under the governance regulation is going to be really essential here. So under the NECPs for FOLU sector actions, the Commission recently reviewed the draft update plans, and there's still much more needed ambition in these plans. So how can we enhance strategic planning to make sure that member states are taking the right measures that are needed? For new instruments, as I just mentioned, the Commission looked into an exploratory study for perhaps having a separate ETS for agriculture. So there's lots of questions about, if you do introduce an ETS, where would the point of obligation be? Would it be on farm, where you're talking about possibly having millions of obligated parties because there's over 9 million farms in the EU? Or would you have certain thresholds where you would only take the largest farms? Or could it be either upstream, where it's fertilizer and feed producers, or downstream, where you're looking at meat and dairy processors, or even going further downstream and looking at secondary processors? And then also the scope of emissions that you would have included in ETS. Would you just focus on non-CO2 emissions or just livestock emissions? Would you include LULUCF emissions and removals? So there's lots of questions about how you would design this and how you would incentivize emission reductions both at the farm gate and up and downstream in the agri-food value chain. And as I mentioned already, we're going to need demand-side measures. So how can you incentivize consumer behavior change? So information campaigns to get dietary changes obviously is some low-hanging fruit that will be looked into. Other measures such as voluntary and mandatory food labeling to give consumers more information about this. But also, as mentioned this morning, maybe changing procurement rules as well to incentivize dietary changes in behavior. So for our panel today, we sort of have some open questions that need to be addressed, obviously not just today, but in the coming months and years. But would an option such as an agriculture ETS or other types of polluter pays options be the best possible instrument for reducing agri-food emissions? And also, would it be the right kind of tool to increase removals? If you're going to include removals, do you include payments for removals? How would you do this, and how would you incentivize increasing removals? And so what, if you are going to have an agriculture ETS, if you're going to reform the Common Agricultural Policy, what else is needed in the wider policy mix to be able to support these kinds of policies? These are big questions that need answering. And with the recent backtracking that we discussed this morning on different legislation for the agricultural sector, what kind of levers are going to be needed to deliver on climate mitigation? And how can it be done in a way where we can ensure a just transition, because this is high on people's minds, to make sure that we align these goals for better social equality in Europe, but also reaching our climate goals to avoid worst-case scenarios. So I would invite our panelists to come up and come speak with us today about these big questions that we have. So thank you.
Yeah, so please come take a seat. Yes. So, yeah, I mean, we've had a bit of an overview then of the agenda on climate regarding the agricultural sector, and we'd like to hear from all of you. What's your reaction in particular? Let's start maybe with this question of pricing carbon in agri-food supply chains. Is that the tool to get emissions down in the sector? What are some of the challenges you might see with that? What are the benefits of going that way? And then later we'll come on to what wider policies we might need as well. But just to focus first on your views on, do we need a carbon pricing tool for agriculture? Maybe I'll just start in order of proximity. Marco, do you want to kick us off?
Thanks a lot, Harriet, for the introduction, and thanks, Julia, for the presentation. Indeed, the application of the agri-ETS... Does it work? Okay, sorry. The application of the agri-ETS, the ETS to the agriculture sector is clearly one of the big topics that the next Commission and the next political terms we will be looking at. We do have concerns in the sense that for us it's important that this doesn't become a system where polluters or emitters have actually the right to pay for emitting, for polluting, and keep polluting. So it's essential that the system that will be created will deliver effective emission reductions. And this is also linked to the other big problem that Julia mentions already, of the relationship between reducing emissions, methane, nitrous oxides, and CO2, and carbon removals. Within the carbon removal concept and debate, there are issues related to the quantification. There are many scientific concerns, but also concrete concerns about how the quantification is being made. We have seen every second week scandals about projects that are supposed to deliver carbon sequestration that are either false or have dramatically exaggerated their contributions. And but I'd say, generally speaking, the approach of the agri-ETS that can have positive elements should be looked at by bearing in mind that we need to be careful when we only focus on emissions intensities. Because emissions intensity very often lead to either no gain or absolute increase in emissions. Because that's how society and that's how economy works. So for us, it's still very important, and I hope they'll be able to talk later about other policies. The main element must be to focus policies and political debates on reducing emissions from our activities, rather than trying to play with the removals as well.
Thanks, Marco. Rudolf, to you next. From the farmer's perspective, I'd be interested to hear, on your farm, how have you taken action to reduce emissions, or are you planning that in the future, and what's your experience of that? And then B, on this question of carbon pricing, how would you see that playing out for you as a farmer?
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm Rudolf from Latvia, a young farmer, organic cereal farmer. So for me, it was not topic till now. I have some friends that have done it, that have tried to sequestrate carbon in their soils. They have managed, but it's just few hectares. It's not a big quantity. So we have trying to understand the process. But about ETS in agriculture, we just had a working group yesterday. And it was a lot of questions and not too many answers. We see that we can mitigate emissions in agriculture, in farming, also in the individual level, but we have doubts that if we start to trade emissions, it cannot lead to mitigation also. These are our doubts. And then if you look at on-farm practices, it's most likely that it will be a lot of administrative burden within the system because, as it said before, it's 9 million farmers there. At this, it is existing, it's 11,000 participants, right? Approximately. So we need to make it simple for farmers to achieve and to use them in the farming sector. So it's a big, big question that's, as we see in CAP strategic plans, it's hard to get there if there are too many questions. And for upstream or downstream system, we see that there will be, of course, a price increase within the process. So a lot of questions, yeah.
Okay, thanks. So also kind of highlighting the importance of the design as well of this system. Megan, coming to you now, you're coming from a slightly different angle and perspective, I guess, that you're really working with investors in agri-food supply chains. I mean, what's your perspective on kind of the importance of emissions reduction in agriculture, and what do you see as the key needs policy-wise for trying to achieve those goals?
So let me see, do I have this on? Do I press here? Oh, it's on. Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, I should probably introduce myself, everyone else, but just quickly, because my organization is a bit different than most of the others we'll hear from today. And I work for the FAIR Initiative, and it's a $70 trillion investor network. It's the largest ESG it's the fastest growing ESG network in the world. And what we're focused on, what our mission is sort of building awareness of the material risks and opportunities in the food sector, particularly in animal agriculture, to investors. And so we've got about 400, a little over 400 members, 40% of whom are in Europe, about 30% in the United States, and 30% in the rest of the world. And just as a quick, it surprises people that investors are as engaged in this as investors are. But things like emissions, if we can't figure out to get climate under control, if we can't address issues around biodiversity loss, around pollution, around excessive use of antibiotics in the animal agricultural sector, and the risks that presents from antibiotic resistance, then this is a material risk to the investors, and it's a systemic risk to the whole planet, and therefore to the economies, and therefore to investors. So we're very engaged in harnessing the power of capital markets to build a more sustainable and equitable food system. So that, I apologize for giving that backdrop, but I think it'll make everything I say for the rest of the time make a little more sense because it is a different angle we're coming from. So yes, reducing emissions is really important. There's a real awareness, and there's a statistic here I can share which says we basically produce a great deal of high quality scientific and financial research, which then we make available to investors to help inform their decisions. And one of the things we have is a thing called the climate risk tool. And it basically looks forward to the scenario of impact on capital if we do breach 2%, for example. And so it's pointed out that the sector's profitability, so this is animal agriculture sector profitability, 50% of the companies will be in the red if we reach 2% change in climate. So for the sector specifically, it matters. And so investors are speaking to the companies, and it's an additional prod toward movement. We also push a lot and work a lot with investor letters asking for policy changes. And many of them do focus in on emissions, but we're very clear that it's all interrelated, so that if you have climate unifocus, you could address that issue, and yet we could still destroy the capacity for human life, for good environmental and good economic viability if we don't also address nature. So just to say, yes, emissions is very important, and in all of it, we're really conscious of wanting it to be science-based and just recognizing there's a lot of innovative ideas out there. The investors want to see the innovation, want to test ideas. Some of them are going to work and some are not going to work very well as we move to food transition. And there are questions about greenwashing and then measurements. And so in answer to how any of this would work, I would align with much of what Marco said, which is let's get doing it and then let's get data that shows which things actually are working best, and reduction of emissions is an essential part of it.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, I think that also links back to the discussion this morning as well about how also we need to be aware of the economic risks of not taking action on climate, and really good to have some examples, or interesting to have some examples of actually how that hits agriculture as well, which I think we're seeing more and more of, also not only for the animal sector, but in especially arable production as well in Europe as well. Yes, Valeria, I mean, you've been really working on this, for probably some time in the European Commission. So be really interested to hear your perspective on, what's the thinking in terms of the tools to bring down agricultural emissions and, the idea around carbon pricing. And
thank you, and thank you for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Okay. So Julia actually already made a very good introduction to the topic, which then cancels half of my speaking points, because of course we have this target for we proposed a target for 2040, which is to reduce emissions by 90%. And if you looked carefully at the graph she showed, it shows that the land sector, agriculture and LULUCF combined, will make up for the most of the greenhouse gas profile in 2040. So climate policies for the land sector must be very targeted and effective. But it also recognizes that agriculture will remain the sector with the largest share of emissions in 2040 because these are emissions that are harder to abate. We cannot completely decarbonize the food system as we can do for other sectors. So, this calls for a clear, predictable, and also ambitious policy framework for the land sector, but also for, we heard this morning, the finance and the instruments that the farmers need for this transition. So yes, we commissioned this study that Julian and Aaron and colleagues worked on, and that was published last year in November, on exploring ideas how carbon pricing in agriculture will work. What is interesting in this approach is that, first of all, you look at the entire food value chain. This is important because maybe so far one problem was that when talking about agriculture, we always focus on the farmers, but a lot of the decisions that farmers make are actually as a response to choices made in other parts of the value chain. Upstream, the inputs they can put on their fields also have a big role in the amount of emissions that they create, and also downstream, of course, the food producers, the retailers, and the consumers will drive farmers' decisions. So we need a holistic approach. I think this by now is quite common knowledge, and is also very much reflected in the narrative we promoted in the communication on the 2040 targets. And if you take this value chain approach, you could actually see carbon pricing not as a stick for the farmer, but rather as a carrot. If you can manage to design it in a way that the entity responsible for the emissions happening on the farm are actually not the farmers, but either upstream input producers or downstream the food producers. And they will have then an incentive to reward, to pay the farmers to decrease their emissions so that they need to buy fewer allowances. This I'm simplifying, but the idea would be that then the farmer gets rewarded for reducing emissions. And this could create that sort of private finance that will complement public support from the CAP that seems to be needed, as we discussed this morning. There is also a huge an important element with the market power distribution in the value chain. And for sure, if we introduce carbon pricing in the food for the food system, this will alter the market power balance in the value chain. How this exactly will happen is still to be understood. So there are many impacts the impacts on market power that I just mentioned, impacts on trade, impacts on prices, on income of farmers, that we still need to understand. That's why we are still in an exploratory phase, and we want to continue this exploration, and we will follow up on that study with a series of technical workshops where we want to discuss with the stakeholders directly involved, directly impacted by such a system. We want to gather their views and understand what the impacts will be in their expectation. So we don't have an answer, and we certainly don't have a decision to make a legal proposal for the moment, because of course we wait to see who our next bosses will be. So for the moment it's really an idea that we want to be ready in case this becomes a priority for the next commission, but this is of course still too early to say. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, Aaron, you're someone else who's also been working on this for a long time as well. Is there anything that you want to also complement in terms of, a lot of people have talked about the importance of design, and there's just so many options for how you could design a carbon pricing instrument in agriculture. So what's your general take, obviously, on the question of pricing, and do we need that instrument? But also maybe if you could elaborate a little bit more on some of the things you've heard about design and some of the options, and what's your view on them?
Yes, so maybe first to comment on what was said before, to understand the role of agriculture to reach climate neutrality. So when IPCC says 1.5 limit is still reachable, what they actually mean is we will overshoot this decade for a few decades to return at some point with the help of carbon removals. So, and what does that mean? Overshoot means adverse impacts for humans and environment. And this leads us into a vicious cycle, because the more we overshoot and the longer we overshoot, the less likely our nature-based solutions, the functioning of our environment to act as a carbon sink, will decrease. And if you look at the trajectory, and Valeria just mentioned it, so agriculture by 2040 will be a high-emitting sector. So it will play a key role in deciding on by how much we will overshoot and for how long we will overshoot. And it will also decide on how well our nature-based solutions in reducing the CO2 and storing it into the ground will actually function. If we put that together, so basically agriculture is our insurance model to reach climate neutrality by 2050. And I think here are three building blocks to see on what can agriculture actually do. It can reduce emissions, and mainly what I see here is the livestock sector, reducing the emissions here, complemented by a more plant-based diet and dietary changes, and reducing the emissions from drained peatlands. The second building block is then to increase and incentivize carbon removals, but we have to understand that there's a very limited scope of what these nature-based solutions can actually deliver. And the third one is then climate change adaptation and increasing the resilience of the sector. And then we also have to acknowledge the fact that the colleagues out there were protesting today, again, not only in Brussels, but also all over Europe, on where they stand in this discussion. So, and what I always say is that they're stuck in an export subsidy trap. So they're dependent on the exports where Europe has pushed them into, and they have willingly accepted. They are dependent on the subsidies that Europe and also national governments give them. And they're dependent on the value chain actors, the big players in the upstream and downstream sectors who dominate and rule the market. So, and then this is circled also by the administration burden. And then and we have to discuss this morning, what policymakers and politicians they make out of this is to decrease the environmental ambition to ease the farmers. But this is not what they actually asked for. And I think this is now the picture that we have to understand when we now pull in the carbon pricing mechanisms, which is just a tool to finance the transition of a high-emitting sector into a low-emitting sector. And what worries, what not worries me is that we talk about carbon pricing. I think that is a good point now to start the discussion. What worries me is, do we get by 2030, 2040, 2050 a system in place that is scientifically robust, that is stringent enough to reduce the emissions, but at the same time to be easy enough and simple enough for farmers to actually be implemented? So I think these are the questions that I am asking myself and which we need to further explore. And yeah, happy also to go into that discussion on what could be the design elements of such a carbon pricing instrument and also of other policy instruments to get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, we really wanted to cover then the wider policy mix, I think, which is what you bring us on to. Maybe I go back to you, Rudolf. I mean, you were one of the ones who said there's a lot of questions, obviously, for you about how this would work. But at the same time, you know, we've heard quite a bit this morning about the need for financing, and I think, Valeria, you were mentioning this as well. So beyond pricing emissions in agriculture as one tool, what do you see as the real needs for you in terms of trying to obviously transition to a system, or speaking on behalf of farmers more generally, that you know, trying to move to a system obviously that is better for the environment, is lower carbon? I mean, what are the key barriers and how do you feel policy can help to try and address those?
So before this question, maybe I can add on. Two of you mentioned that science-based. We totally agree on that, but we need to remember that every soil is different. So it should be also practice-based and individual farm level. So there should be practices we can implement, but there is a question, will there be a result? So that's also a point we need to keep in mind. And about how can we accelerate towards this topic, I think first of all, we need to share knowledge about practices and innovations and possibilities. How can we do it? That's number one. The second biggest part is finance, how we can finance the innovation for carbon removal. And it could also be risk sharing, because at this moment, most of the risk for innovations is on farmers' shoulders. So, and we invest not in short term. So when we make investment, it's for at least 5 years, mostly 10 years, to get the money back. So it's a long-term investment. And we can't take this risk every year, every 2 years. So it's really, really long-term vision, how we move forward. And also the accessibility for land, because now we have 50% land owned by farmers and 50% rented. And in many places, we don't have long-term leases. So it's really big risk to invest in rented land if you will not be able to work on it next year. So there should be burdens that we can be able and risk-free to invest in soils. So, and that's the risk manager, the third point, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Megan, what about the private sector? I mean, can you help us to reflect what should the role be? Because we've said that not everything can be also done by public policy. So what should we expect from the private sector in terms of supporting the types of investments and maybe the knowledge that's needed? Or also from the other point of view, what does the private sector also need from policy, right?
Right.
So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that.
There's so much interplay back and forth. And so just quickly, there's an enormous amount of subsidization, and obviously CAP here in Europe, but globally. The World Bank has just come up with a report, which I strongly recommend people read, calling Detox Development. And it talks about repurposing subsidies. So one big piece is that there's a lot of money going out, and this report is pointing to how much of it unintentionally is actually bringing about environmentally negative consequences, right? So the FAIR initiative, through our investors, wrote a letter to the EU in 2021 saying that we, the undersigned investors, and it was, I think, investors with about $10 trillion of assets under management, saying there's room to do better alignment. So it's not that there's not money, it's that the money is being spent and could be redirected. We've also then just this past year, with investors of $7 trillion worth of assets under management, have written to the G20 finance ministers and put the same point to them. So there's the first part is the repurposing of some of the government money. The second point is that as investors read through the information that we're producing and look at these various things that are material risks, which basically, if I have the full transparent information about 3 different companies, and I can see that one of them is exposed to much more risk because their value chain up and down, like from a scope 3 point of view, they've got a lot of emissions, and I can see that countries might begin to take issue with it. We as investors would be concerned about it. The public might be concerned. I could view that will affect who I invest in. And as this has become more of a thing for investors and for the public and with government pressure, you see companies putting a lot of money. So another big place where money is coming from are actually some of the big companies. So just to name a couple European ones, Nestle and Unilever have both put a lot of money into regenerative agriculture. And so that is another space. And then there's obviously funding that comes from private investors, from philanthropy. There's a lot of different places the money comes to, but as a general matter, all of them are looking for a clear roadmap. And that's another thing FAIR did, which was that FAIR investors spoke and said, what we need is actually a believable plan on how the world could get to 1.5. And so investors wrote, in that case, it was $19 trillion worth of investors. But the main point is these are the world's biggest pension funds, investment houses from around the world, all saying, actually, this matters to us, and said that they really needed the FAO to come up with a roadmap on how we could move the agricultural sector globally to be in alignment. They're now working on this. The first draft came out at COP28. There's another one at COP29, another one at COP30. All of them are calling it for national plans that will then line up with this. Basically, what they're all looking for and what they're looking for from Europe, and frankly, Europe has done more of this than anyone else. The green, as you look at the Green Deal, you can see things that have fallen a little shorter than people would have wanted, things that have been shelved. But overall, what was there was a roadmap and a commitment that these things have to happen with bumps in the road. And investors are used to the idea of bumps in the road, but they need to know a direction of travel. And once there's that direction of travel and the comfort and certainty of that, then people can begin building plans. And that is something that I think gets, you sort of say, well, we would just like some money from X or Y to make this happen. There has to be the question of, well, what are we making happen? And is it going to be built upon? And are the other people who are playing a part of this all on board with the idea? Have we done a good enough job of bringing the farmers into the discussion? If we haven't, we need to, because the plan's not going to work if we don't. And so we also have, reports on how to get at just transition. And sort of the investors are looking at this as they would look at anything else. And is this yet fit for purpose? And how do we get it so that it is? I hope that helps.
Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, I think also you're saying similar things to what Rudolf was saying about the need for more certainty about the direction of travel. Valeria, I don't know if you want to comment on that at all. I mean, the role of the EU, obviously, in setting the direction of travel. Yeah, like Megan was saying, we have the Green Deal. It's got targets for 2030 on the food system, but obviously we've heard this morning that that's where we're seeing the least progress being made. What do you see in terms of or other discussions happening, also in relation to these international agreements now that are coming, where the EU has also signed up since the last COP to including the agri-food sector in its climate plans by 2025, etc. So do you see a movement towards a kind of vision, or their efforts to create this kind of vision and pathway, like you were saying, for the sector towards 1.5? So what's happening on there? Do you see that as something that is needed?
It is true that legislation on the farm and food sector is not the easiest one to work on. And many of the initiatives announced in the Farm to Fork strategy are indeed were not adopted or shelved. The Sustainable Food System framework, in the inclusion of livestock in the IED was eventually dropped. And many more that Julia mentioned. So I could say one positive piece of feedback that we hear a lot since the publication of the study on carbon pricing is that this at least will provide some long-term vision, predictability, clarity for farmers, for the food system that have to direct their investments. So the way an ETS works, I know you asked not to be too technical, but many people in the food systems, well, in the farming sector maybe are not familiar with ETS because it has not so far covered agriculture, but the idea is that there is a cap on emissions, on the emissions that the sector can produce. This cap decreases. So polluting companies, in the case of the EU ETS, these are big industries like energy manufacture, they have to buy allowances for each ton of CO2 that they emit in the atmosphere, and the number of allowances that are available decreases over time, and this means that allowances should in principle become more expensive. This of course also depends on how much pollution there is, so prices go down when there is a decrease in production, but the idea is that there is this really clear, long-term, predictable pathway for emissions. And this applied to the farming sector could also provide some certainty in terms of investments. Then there is the other positive side of an ETS is that it creates revenues when these allowances are sold in auctions, and this is a huge source of revenues for member states who are supposed to use these revenues for making this transition easier. So the first EU ETS, with that money, we created an innovation fund that finances low carbon technologies. So this helps the polluters to have alternatives, in fact, to pollute less. In the case of the ETS2, which will enter into force as of 2027, and which will cover buildings and the transport sector, there the most impacted people will be the citizens who need to heat their houses and drive their cars. And so in that case, what the money that comes out of it will be used for a social climate fund supposed to help vulnerable households. So with all this, the use of the revenues is also a very important part of the policies, not just stick, but also using the money to make the transition easier for the most affected ones. In the case of the farming sector, money that could collected through an ETS would then go to what? That is also a design question. Do we use the same approach of the EU ETS and then we use it for innovation? As Rudolf said, research and innovation is very important to give the farmers the means to decrease their emissions. Or should it go to support vulnerable households because of the potential increase in food prices? Or should it go to a fund to procure or to pay for removals and biodiversity, which is also, as we know, very important to make farming, to make food systems work. If ecosystems collapse, we don't have any food. So there is also this positive feedback that, okay, we can have some revenues. How we use them is still an open question, but there are some attractive features of an ETS which have proven to work with the EU ETS. It took a while. It took 20 years of phase-in and building, gradually building the system, but we can learn from the lessons of the EU ETS, which is already in place, and be a bit faster in the case of the agricultural sector. But then, of course, another feedback that we receive a lot is this cannot go alone. It has to be done together with accompanying measures for helping with the transition, but also for making sure that this has no no negative impacts on biodiversity, animal welfare, and trade, and so on. So it's a huge challenge because you need to take into account the trade aspects, which were mentioned this morning, but less so in this panel. Should we then protect our farmers because they will be subject to higher requirements than farmers in other parts of the world? But how could a CBAM-like model work for farming, which is so complex? The MRV is so complex, as we said. Quantification of emissions, and the removals will be so complex. So yeah, it's interesting, but it needs a lot of of coordination with many other policy areas. This is clear. So a good exercise for the next Commission to put together many DGs and many constituencies together.
Yeah, thank you. And also I think probably underlines the importance of having a target that does set the direction of travel for many different policies to then align with. Maybe I can go to the social aspects of this, which people have been saying, well, part of the follow-up to the Green Deal needs to be more of a focus on the social consequences and actually trying to align environmental and socially just outcomes with changes that we're making. And so I want to see how you see this for the farming sector. Marco, I'll probably go to you first. What do you think can be delivered by EU policy that actually tries to break through some of the protests that we're seeing, the opposition to the Green Deal? How do we kind of move forward and get beyond that and forge a dialogue where we can try and, build a bit more consensus, right, rather than increasingly going in these opposite directions?
Yeah, that's an easy question. So there are a few things that I think should be said. One is that climate change is not just increasing temperatures, it's not just a few tough consequences on our planet. It's, as the European Environment Agency, we have the executive director here, said, it's a risk multiplier. It means that there are cascades between different sectors, from one region to another, from one region of the world to another. It leads to possibly social unrest, to political tensions. And we have seen that with the farmers' protests. So we should not just look at it as one indicator. It is something that will and has already started clearly affecting our society as a whole. And another thing that the EA has said is that the forecast that we have and the risk assessment figures that we have are inherently conservative, which means that we are working and we are looking at policies with very optimistic figures in mind. So when looking at the impacts that climate change and our policies have on society, we really have to be serious about the impacts of climate change. Then, of course, if you're a farmer in Spain, now water scarcity starts becoming a mega issue. North of Italy, floods are an even more, that's a difference between life and death, business-wise or also from a purely human perspective. When it comes to the way in which we've been dealing with farmers and with the agri-food sector, I think it's clear that the Farm to Fork, the Green Deal as such, the biodiversity strategy, and several other pieces of legislation or visions from the Commission have been, so to say, imposed on this sector. Why? Because the sector hasn't done much. Again, I think it's the EA from last year and also the Commission Advisory Board on Climate Change. It's since 2005, and Julia said it, we had a 2% reduction in the past almost 20 years. 2% is not enough. And if we continue with business as usual, we're going to get to 1.5% reduction, possibly something more. This is not possible. Every single sector of our society needs to move. We can't just pretend that we don't touch this sector. But then how this sector moves, that's the completely different thing. That's where the common agricultural policy starts playing a massive role. We've seen before, even starting from 2008, but then with COVID and then with the war in Ukraine, Before, the answer was, we don't have money. There is no money, we can't. And then, as soon as a real crisis happens, billions, hundreds of billions can be found in a matter of few weeks. And since we are now facing a planetary and existential crisis, whether we want it or not, we need to find money. And it's clearly more than the 60 billion euro per year that the CAP distributes. But again, once we have those 60 billions, we need to provide answers to the people that put their lives on the field. And what most farmers are criticizing and demanding right now is not for the Commission to kill green legislation within the CAP, is to get a much better economic reward by the market and also to get better subsidies, because everybody knows that the CAP, since 30 years now, provides 80% of its payment to 20% of farms. And this has to stop. We cannot continue with a system that rewards land ownership, because we are paying rich people. Before Brexit, the CAP was giving money to the Queen of England. It's insane. It's a social policy, despite not being a social policy. It is a social policy for many farmers, but it gives money to rich landowners. Yeah. This is something that politically speaking cannot be accepted anymore. So we need to talk to farmers much more seriously and much more continuously, but we also need to stop fooling them, because the recent political decisions are driven not by science, are not driven by any other economic or farmer request. They are driven by electoral purposes.
Rudolf, can I let you respond there?
Yeah,
what's your take? Is that the right analysis?
As a young farmer, we totally agree on these points, of course. But you mentioned before we need clear goals where to go. But what we lack, also in existing and previous CAPs, we lack tools to achieve them. We haven't been given tools to achieve the goals. We have high numbers from top to down. We don't have practices and tools to go from bottom to up. So we need to collaborate on that way. That's a big, big step why there are so many protests today, because we have goals, but we don't have tools to achieve them. Mm. That's one of frustrations, yes. And what's also a question, one more, or that's...
Well, I wanted to ask, generally all of you, the way forward kind of out of this polarization. I mean, you've talked about how we can try to break down some of the barriers and some of the needs. But as a young farmer, I mean, you've just said that you agree a lot with Marco's analysis, and I assume you're also referring to the CAP there. So it seems like there is some scope, for coming together, at least amongst certain interests within the farming sector. So, yeah, if you have any more thoughts on really for you what would be a way to try and go forward, I guess, together rather than this constant kind of pulling in opposite directions and going back and forth on policy, which seems to not really be providing the certainty that we need.
Yeah, so I think one point I have already mentioned, it should be policy that is easy to use for farmers, that there is as less as possible bureaucracy in there. Then we need a long-term vision in offering predictability for farmers. So as I mentioned before, investments take years, maybe sometimes 10 and more than 10 years. So that's also, and also before there was mentioned about regenerative agriculture and other sustainable practices. What we see that we need solid governments to avoid multiple objectives. We need clear definition what is sustainable, because at this moment we have retailers that says this is sustainable, processors that something else is sustainable, government says anything else. So we don't have a clear vision of what is sustainable for us. And also, I'm glad that you're here, realistic view and take on finance. We lack money a lot. Like if you look at last year, we are 62 billion below what we need in agriculture in Europe. So we need more inputs from money side also. It could be different. It could be loans. It could be CAP. It could be any different ways. But still, it should be put a lot of money there.
May I just ask a
Sure.
question? Because that's a really interesting number. When you say that, in what way is that money missing? Is that the amount of money that's needed to be able to support the farmers to produce? Because is it falling to certain segments within the sector that are most hurt? Because there are exports being produced, and there is food being produced that goes to market, and there are farmers who are managing to stay afloat financially. So when you say this money is missing, sort of in what way is that measured? I don't doubt you. I just really want to understand it so I can go back and explain it to other people.
Yeah, it's if I remember correctly, it's the money that is there is a financial gap within agriculture that through investments to maintain our practices, to maintain businesses as we need it, and there was that for young farmers especially, we lack short-term loans for us for daily basis to operate. For young farmers, it was 14 billion euros. That's not there for us. So it's also
That's
a
pretty
daily
good, that's a pretty good
operation.
piece of the whole 62. I mean, so if you're missing 14 for the young farmers for that alone, that's a fairly significant share of it. And therefore, it points to the larger point that Marco and others have been making, and this is true in Europe and in the United States and in many, many places. A large share of the subsidies do land in the hands of some of the largest and sometimes wealthiest farmers, and less in the hands of the small ones. So a really good hard look at that strikes me. And that's not an official fair statement, just me thinking about it and saying, although that is the sort of thing FAIR wants to look at across the board, is where are the numbers and how is it all going, and how do you get as many possible of the arrows pointing to hit the same side of the barn, the same objective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the barriers to finance for more green initiatives is also the way that a lot of banks traditionally give out their loans is based on things like increasing productivity or etc. So it's not really done factoring in things like climate risks and all of these new dimensions. So maybe also, you want to talk to the banks amongst your network as well. And I think there are some, there's Rabobank and others who are starting to actually rethink the metrics that they use for assessing risk and who they grant loans to, and trying to get more access to loans for younger farmers and
right. I mean, and absolutely
those wanting to,
the analysis that we are doing, looking up and down, so from the entire stream of the inputs. So we're looking at the risks that happen at the grain level. We're looking at the risks that come to animal pharma companies, to people who produce pesticides, how each of those companies is impacted, and then investors factor that into their decisions, and they're looking straight through to the companies that produce meat, to the retailers who sell the meat. But as each of those companies was looking at these questions, then basically, if you believe there to be a significant risk, it then results in higher interest rates where you see the risks. And so if you begin to think of risk as something different than what you just thought of it, sort of, our grandfather's view of it didn't include any of these things, and that's what we're trying to have happen. But then a secondary question is taking aside a risk, which is a younger farmer who doesn't have as much capital or proof of having been successful in paying back loans. That type of risk is a kind of thing that has to get mitigated against, so that the money does get to these people. And the question of some blended finance, some amount of government backing and support of standing behind and guaranteeing an interest rate, but banks working together. There's a lot of interesting ways where some risk we want people to be taking on, because the risk of trying something new is in fact how we move toward the solutions.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's probably some more interesting discussions to happen on blended finance options in the future, I think, in this policy area. Aaron, just coming back to you, I mean, are there things that you've heard that you want to react on in terms of the work that you do, I think, across lots of different policy areas? And is there anything specific that you would like to say on the CAP and maybe how what you see maybe as the role for the CAP when we're saying that we need investment, and also the fact that the next CAP will be agreed before any eventual ETS would come into place and start having an impact? What's the linkages between that and the whole kind of policies that might be enacted on the climate side?
Yeah, that's a problem. Again, we have if you look at the timeline, that is very displaced again of when the CAP and the MFF come into place and when the discussion on carbon pricing are being, and the decisions are being taken. So I think that's again an issue we also had in the past, that we really struggled to get these things aligned, these tools. And I think there was an important point that was made this morning, that if the market doesn't pay the fair price to the farmers, then the public has to do that and pay the share. And that's what the Common Agriculture Policy currently does. So, and if you want to turn this around so that the market is paying the fair price, and that then the Common Agriculture Policy is actually a tool to finance the transition, then really we need to first have the other incentives in place, carbon pricing, carbon removal certification, to then steer the CAP towards the transition. And this is ultimately also where I would see the Common Agriculture Policy to do three things. To have the investments ready, to implement this system redesign in the agriculture, these system redesign measures, to maintain them, because it's not an investment only, it's also ongoing cost that needs to be financed for the farmers, and to have this knowledge and advisory support for finance, which is currently in the CAP like a small measure in the CLIMA, which is really not a lot, which should be like a large share, like 1/3 of the CAP, to really support the farmers in understanding what society needs, and to go ahead with this transition. And I think it's also good to think in examples on where the CAP can come in here. So if you think about organic soils, what happens is if you drain them, then CO2 is being emitted every year. And once you re-wet them, then emissions stop immediately. What then happens is methane emissions kick in, which is also important to consider, but the emissions, the CO2 emissions stop immediately. But that's a huge investment to do. So going from a drainage-based agriculture back to a wet agriculture, maybe based on paludiculture. So if a farmer needs these three things. He needs the investment, he needs the supply chain, of course, going from drainage-based agriculture towards paludiculture, and then he needs the maintenance of these measures, and he needs the knowledge to do that. So I think that's the key where I see the CAP in the future to do this job. There's other examples with agroforestry systems. We need the investments cost, we need the maintenance, we need the knowledge. And yeah, so I think that would be the complement with where I see with carbon pricing and where they could go hand in hand here.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to the audience.
Could I just add just a quick thing?
Okay, very quickly.
Because Aaron's mentioned a couple times about the trade piece of it, right? So the question of mirror clauses ahead of a time where you actually have sort of some sort of how you do it with emissions at the border. There are other spaces where you can create a dynamic where if a certain policy has been put in place in the EU, so the EU has done this on antibiotics, antibiotics given to food animals, the EU, out of concern for human health, has put in more stringent laws than many other countries on use of antibiotics, and it has now said it's in the process of developing the the trade ban that will go into place and say products that contain inputs from food animals will not be allowed into the EU if they come from animals that were given antibiotics as growth promoters or yield increasers. And so what that basically says is, we know we're asking you to make a shift here in Europe. We know that the shift is difficult and costly in the transition, and even afterwards, sometimes there will and sometimes there won't with these changes be a longer cost to production. It's not always the case that there would be. But whatever the case, in order to uphold the policy objective of the EU has a right, and this is consistent with WTO regulations. It's promoting a policy that is important to the EU, and it's being done to save people's lives in the EU and around the world, because excess and misuse of antibiotics in animals does result in the spread of antibiotic resistance to humans. So these type of mechanisms, the farmers are often asking for them. Well, then you have a situation in which you have a level playing field within the EU. If it costs a little bit more to make your product, people in the EU will pay a little bit more, and obviously there are people who are food insecure, but there are systems in place to help people who are already food insecure be able to receive food, and they will still be able to do so with slightly higher price for their eggs or what have you. But it allows the policy change to happen in a way that then frees up more of the CAP to do the sort of things that Erin was just suggesting.
Thank you, yeah. And also, again, bringing up another policy area where we kind of need to try and make things coherent with the right policy mix, like we say, though. Yeah, we know that there's a lot of complication when it comes to trade agreements and agriculture. So, yeah, can we go to the audience? Hopefully that this has inspired some of you to ask questions. Yes, over here. We're going to take them just in groups, so we'll take you, and then if there's others from the audience, we'll take them. Otherwise, also if there's any online.
Well, thank you. My name is Lars Holgaard. I was formerly Deputy Director General in DG Agriculture, so I know a little bit about what's been discussed in here, the reform. Just a couple of words in relation to the direct payments. The direct payments are not dependent on production. I think that has to be underlined. They are decoupled. They do not incentivize farmers to produce more or less. So there's no export trap. This is simply based on the market signals that farmers receive. It's true that a lot of the money goes to the biggest farmers. Member states have the possibility to do redistribution, to give it more to the small farmers, to give it to the young farmers to support. Member states have not utilized that to the extent that it's possible, but that is the case. Now, coming to the subject of the discussion, a carbon tax, and I happen to be Danish, is discussed very intensively in Denmark. It's sort of a decision by the government that farming has to be also incorporated. And this, I think, leads immediately to the point of you need a special emission trading system, as Valeria was saying, for farming. They're operating with three different models. One is 100 euros per ton of emissions, another is 60, and another one which is lower. If you take the 100, which was the price of the ETS for some time ago, it's not that high right now, it would have significant effect on production. It would have the consequence of prices being increased to consumers. So there are these side effects.
Sorry, what was your question?
So I think the question is really, we should try to combine a carbon tax, in such a manner that it has an effect on reducing emissions, but it also forces consumers to pay the real price, because they don't pay the real price. There are externalities here. And so it should be a combination of a tax on farmers to reduce emissions, incentivize them, but also on consumers. And that money could then be rechanneled back to the farming sector for the necessary adaptation to be more climate friendly and so environmental friendly. So there are, I think, ideas here. The complications are there, as you say, in terms of administration. And you need, in addition to a special ETS for farming, you need a special CBAM. Because otherwise you're distorting trade and competition for our farmers versus third countries. So that has to be taken into account as well. I'd like you if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Julia, is there anything online? Okay. So yeah, if you'd like to respond, who? Yeah.
Let's start. Thanks a lot, Lars. There are many concerns about the way in which the CAP is being implemented, and if we look at the sector that should change as a matter of priority, so the livestock sector, which I mean, many commentators agree that that's where we need to focus. Agriculture emits 95% of ammonia, and 80% comes from livestock. It emits 54% of methane, and basically 95% comes from livestock. The issue is when we look at the way in which member states implement the CAP, that 9% of livestock units present in Europe are subject to specific plans to reduce emissions or to reduce ammonia emissions, which means that 91% of livestock numbers in Europe are left out of the picture. They are not assessed and addressed. And this has to change. I agree that member states could do a redirection of money, but they don't because of political reasons. As Jan has told us this morning, the farming sector has a high political power, and it's not gonna. It's going to be difficult to prevent them from using that political power. So they have agriculture ministers in their hands, and they're not going to want to, change the situation. Why? Because the people that have a grasp of the reality and very much influence on leading politicians at national level are the ones that benefit out of this system. The ones that are losing out of the system are the ones that don't have access to politicians in the same way. So we need to ensure via a public debate that we manage to redirect and have a CAP in the future that will be spending money on the basis of results. This CAP reform was supposed to be results-based. It is still based on direct payments. I really hope that the next CAP, and unfortunately the next CAP reform is already coming because that's what the Commission proposed last week, but the CAP reform that is supposed to come at the end of 2025, I really hope that it will be the first time when direct payments will be changed into results-based payments, because we need to help financially farmers to drive a transition, and it's absolutely necessary to give money, but we also need to give money if farmers and when farmers do something, not just because they own or they work land.
Thanks, Marco. Do others want to respond on the question? Or Aaron or Valeria?
Maybe really quickly to two things that had been said. So in Germany, what we see is that there's a direct correlation between the nitrates directive that were deteriorated in 2006 and came into place, and the exports that just then happened right after to Asian markets, where before we had a production of pig meat that was around, I don't know, like below the share that would need to feed Germany, around 80%, and then right after that was then 120%. So we see these direct correlations, and that's what I was referring to. We have this export trap that farmers are stuck into. It's not necessarily linked to common agriculture policy, but it also, of course, has its share. And then with the question too of how to design a carbon pricing system, and also the reference to the Danish. So, and we have a lot of Danish colleagues here. I think the example that is now being, that we're now receiving from Denmark is very important to understand on how do you design such a system, because they are now the front runners in understanding what are the bits and pieces you need to rethink when designing such a system, which we then have to take into consideration when we start designing such a carbon pricing system. Because yes, maybe it's from the outset it sounds very easy, you put a carbon tax into place and then emissions start decreasing. But the question in the agriculture sector is very important on how do you measure, which greenhouse gases do you measure and how do you track them, and this whole MRV system that you need to have behind is highly complex and should not and needs to be carefully understood, because what we also don't need, and I think that's also important, what we also don't need is a system that is so complex that only a few administration entities in Europe understand how the system works, but nobody else. And then the farmers especially, who then have to implement, are the ones that don't understand the system. So it also needs to be simple enough for the farmers to implement. I think that's also a key learning that we currently have, that we always try to design policies that make things perfect, but then we start deteriorating as soon as they get into force because farmers don't understand it. And because we made it so complex. It's not about that they didn't want to understand, but we made it so complex. So I think that's also a key learning that we need to take into consideration. How do we design a system that is feasible for farmers to implement? Yeah.
If I could just add...
Sorry, Valeria, did you want to?
I forget I didn't hear you.
No, but no, I would just, I mean, the remarks are quite interesting, and I can agree with everything that was said, that we have a lot of impacts to look into, especially in terms of trade, and CBAM, as I mentioned, is one possible way, but CBAM would protect, let's say, from imports, but a lot of the food industry, downstream of the farmer, they are more interested in the impact on the exports, because we still export more food than we import. And so trade goes both ways, and we have to look at both ways together. So it's even more complex. But I really agree with what Aaron just said about the fact that for the farmer, in the end, they just need clarity on what they have to do. Tell us what do you want us to do, and we do it, and give us the means to do it, and we do it. So when it trickles down to the action on the ground, it must be very, very clear.
Can I just see if there's other questions, and if not, we'll come back. Yes, there's one there.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. Damon Hewlett from the Scottish Government Brussels office. Thanks very much for a really informative debate. It's super interesting. Lots to feed back to lots of interested colleagues back home on ideas around what to do in this space. I had a question on the need for long-term vision, certainty. It's probably primarily for you, Rudolf, but maybe others as well might comment. Megan, you talked about this as well. Given the requirement for a long-term vision, would you have preferred the Commission's communication on a 2040 target to have given more detail for the sector? Or are you happy that it deferred on that, looking towards the strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture? And if so, are you confident that that process will give you what you need?
Good question.
Yeah. We have big hopes for strategic dialogue. We are in it. Yeah, we are in it. Yes. Okay. So we have big hopes for strategic dialogue for next Parliament, and we hope they will listen to us, because there are other factors involved there. Of course, the working groups, I just saw one this morning. It's not the easiest one, as always, but still, I think it's one of ways. Of course, it could not be silver bullet, but still, we can try this way. So about long-term vision, what we have seen also is that a lot of visions come from top down, but we need to go from bottom up to make a vision together. So we need to involve more farmers, farmer organizations, to be together and step the goals we want to achieve, and we can achieve together.
And the question was on whether you think that it would provide some clarity to have a target for agriculture in the 2040 European climate targets, specifically for the sector.
Yeah, and then, as I mentioned before, we need to look at tools, if we have them, how to achieve them.
Okay.
They need to be in synergy. Yeah.
Okay. I'm really sorry, but we've actually got to wrap this up. So yeah, maybe if there's just very, very brief final comment. I think, Marco, you want to come in, perhaps Megan, if you can just say one more sentence.
Yeah. On the strategic dialogue, I'm part of it. I'm sitting with colleagues from Rudolf, from the organic sector, Copa-Cogeca, the young farmers unions. There is a lot of interest. I think there is a good participation, but I have to be honest, the latest decisions by the Commission to basically dismantle the greening of the CAP clearly have not been taken with, we are wondering what we are doing there. But the future for agriculture is supposed to, or the strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture is supposed to deliver a pathway for 2035, so after 2030. So in that sense, there is a bit more optimism in the room. I just wanted to say two things. So the first one for me, having a sectoral target for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is essential. Already having a target will drive a lot of other policy decisions and policy actions. And the second target that we need to have is to reduce the amount of animals that we produce, together with policies that drive a change in consumption patterns, because as the EEA, as the advisory board on climate change have said, we can get between 30 to 60% of reductions in the sector if we also touch demand-side actions.
Okay.
And that's impressive and huge, and it's an opportunity we cannot miss.
Okay, thank you, Marco. Megan, are you burning to give your final?
I'm well, not actually burning, but there was something I wanted to mention before, which I think does work as a closing thing, which is I think it's really important that this is not any of it viewed as either or, but both and. So both, they're going to need to be solid goals that are committed to, that every bit of government, so the EU, but then within the member states, and then there has to be really engagement. The farmers can't be simply told, you must do X. There has to be buy-in and engagement, and there has to be ownership of the goal is not flexible. We have to prevent the climate from changing to 2.5, 3. We can't live if we get up to those numbers. And so that urgency that you were describing, we had COVID, we found money. We need to view this with that level of urgency, and there has to be enormous amounts of creativity. Back to COVID, think of how many different people were working on different ways to try to get vaccines, of different ways to identify what the spread was. So there's similar analogies here, which is where do we get the most returns for what we're doing? And therefore, farmers who are willing to say, hey, I'm going to, over the next 4 years, try out a whole bunch of different stuff. I'd like to be part in thinking about the solutions and measuring them, and I'd like to analyze the data. There's room for more payment of that sort. I just want to say that also helps a bit. There are some good things that some big companies are doing. Some of the bigger farmer lobbies tended to represent sometimes some of the groups that have been more vested in the status quo, and I think that the interactions with investors are helping bring some shifts to that. But what the U.S. has done, and you may have heard from my accent and surmised that that's where I'm actually originally from, that this Inflation Reduction Act has given voluntary, so it's
sorry, Megan, I'm going to have to stop you because we are actually out of time. Just
in closing,
round it off,
voluntary money so that farmers who wish to get this stuff called climate smart grants, and then they're paid to test out new things, and they work closely with the scientists to make it happen. That sort of atmosphere buys in people, reduces skepticism, and reduces the ability of any lobbyist who might wish to say these things aren't possible. And I think that's important.
Brilliant, thank you. So, yeah, maybe I can sum this up in 4 words. Targets, vision, investment, and knowledge. So thanks so much for a great discussion. I hope that this has been useful for you and interesting. And we can continue in the break and beyond. I'm sure this will not be a topic that goes away soon. So thank you very much, and thanks to all the panel.